We'll start getting this stuff. All right, give me a minute. I'll be right with you. All right, good deal. All right, sorry I was running just a little bit late. I'm a little out of sorts here. We'll be ready to go here in a moment. We're going to be covering a continuation of the lesson on transmission of the text tonight. We've already covered inspiration, we've already covered canon, which is how we collected the books. Now we're talking about transmission. How did all right, we know that there are no original autographs or copies of the Old or New Testament books, okay? They're not extant anymore. They've been gone for a long time. So what we have, though, are copies of copies that have made their way through the ages. Now, there's a big issue when you start talking about transmission is how do we know, for example, that if we find this old Greek manuscript of the book of John, how do we know that it's accurate and reliable and all those sorts of things? So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about transmission, but as we mentioned last week, I gave you a handout last week that showed you, for example, the New Testament manuscript evidence that we have for what we have collected and translated. And there's almost 6,000 manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts that are collected for the New Testament books. So what ends up happening is that you collect all those manuscripts, and then there's two main, well, I'll come to that. I'm going to get ahead of myself if I'm not careful. I want to talk a little bit about how the collection and recording of all those Greek texts and Hebrew texts occurred, and then also, as you might expect, over thousands of miles for the Roman Empire, there were different approaches as to how the text was recorded. If you come in a room, for example, and you read off a page worth of text to 10 different people, you may get different recordings of that, okay? And what ended up happening, it's a little worse when you start talking about thousands of miles and fragments of manuscripts. What ends up happening is that you have certain approaches that certain groups take on the text. And so I'm going to cover the text types as well tonight, the different text types for the New Testament. Some of you, if you've got a New King James Bible, for example, as you're reading your New King James, a lot of times in the footnote, you'll see a reference to the NU text. The NU text renders this passage, either it does not include this passage or has these words instead in this passage. NU in that case is Nestle Aland United Bible Society text. And so what you have there is you've got, that's a more recent Greek text, if you will. And so you have the NU text, and then you have the Textus Receptus, or the majority text that was used for the King James, and then its its descendant, the New King James. Those were based on a different text. And so you're going to see differences in the way things are rendered, not just in the approach of the translation. Now, I know I'm confusing you a little bit, but it'll become clear, okay? So let's talk a little bit about manuscripts. The Old Testament, it's a little more straightforward, although not a lot more straightforward when we talk about the Old Testament. In regards to the Old Testament, we had a professional group of people that were responsible for copying and assuring the accuracy of what they copied. And who were those people? They were the scribes. They were a professional group of people that took very seriously the responsibility that they had for copying these materials. And so you had, up to the time of the Babylonian captivity, you may remember from your Old Testament history, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, okay? That's when the captivity started, and well, actually it started a little before that, but that's when the Babylonian captivity, the 70 years of captivity in Babylon began. Well, when the Jews were carried away into captivity, they didn't have the temple anymore, A, because it had been destroyed, and B, because they were 1,000 miles away from it, okay? There was no temple. So at that time, there was a change in the way that the Jews started worshiping and how they approached God and everything else, and that's when the synagogue was born, okay, is at the time of the Babylonian captivity. So fast forward a little bit after Cyrus the Great brought the Jews back to Jerusalem, and they reestablished themselves in Jerusalem and continued to grow there. The synagogues continued to stay in place, okay? Later you had Herod the Great that rebuilt the temple in the time of Jesus, or a little bit before, but you had synagogues that had propagated by that time. And so in the neighborhoods and in the individual areas, you had the synagogues where people worship. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can sit in a synagogue service. And it's a very interesting thing to do. We did that. We sat in on a synagogue service in the Orthodox Jewish section of Jerusalem. The men worship separately from the women, of course. They don't worship together. But the synagogues each one of the synagogues had to have their own scriptures to be able to worship with. I mentioned to y'all last week that the way that the scriptures were divided, you remember we talked a little bit about this, the way the scriptures were divided generally was for the public reading. Okay, they would divide out 169 or however many sections that they needed to read through the Bible, and it depends on the synagogue and the location, but to read through the Bible either once every year or once every 3 years. But it was a regular periodic basis. But you had to have a roll. Each synagogue had to have a synagogue scroll. So the scribes were busy. There's a lot of synagogues, and they had to be copied. And so you had all these that were being copied. I wanted to share with you, the Jews realized real quickly that this wasn't something that you could just be careless with. This wasn't something that you just sat down and did in your spare time. It required extreme diligence, it required accuracy, and it required discipline, okay, to sit down and to not make mistakes. So I wanted to share with you some of these, let me just put them all up here. Let's see, there's 9 of them. Okay, let's go through some of these, and you'll see, you kind of get a flavor for what I'm talking about. They could only use clean animal skins both to write on and to bind the manuscripts. Now, as we talked about last week, there's different types of materials they wrote on. There were the papyrus from Egypt that they wrote on. But later, they started writing on animal skins, parchments. Pergamum, one of the 7 churches of Asia in Revelation, Pergamum was where this was invented, this process of using animal skins as a writing surface. So you had those, and then you had vellum. If you were really rich and you were really fortunate, you might have a vellum manuscript. Vellum was the baby, the very soft baby animals. They would take the skins from them and create vellum. And they were the softest, most supple of the manuscripts. All right, so they could only be clean though. The second one, each column of writing could have no less than 48 and no more than 60 lines. So they regulated that. The ink must be black and of a special recipe. And I've got somewhere the material, the formulation that they used for the ink, and it was very precise. They used carbon black or graphite for the most part for their writing material itself, but they regulate very closely the amount of binder they use, the amount of water that they use to thin it with. So again, just part of that same discipline. They must verbalize each word aloud while they were writing. Now, keep that in mind too, because one of the other restrictions we're going to talk about is that they could not record from memory. Okay? They could not record from memory. They were not to trust their memory. They were to copy from text only. But they could verbalize, and they were required to verbalize as they were writing. But why do they do that, do you think? Well, when you say it and see it, isn't it kind of a double check or a little bit more secure way of making sure you're writing the right thing down? And it's like English. The Hebrew had a lot of words that were very similar in sound that meant different things. Okay, so they must wipe the pen and wash their entire bodies before writing the word Jehovah every time they wrote it. We're going to talk about consonants and vowels in a little bit too. That comes into play. There must be a review within 30 days, and if as many as 3 pages are required corrections, then the entire manuscript had to be redone. Okay, if there were corrections on 3 pages in a month, then you start over. Okay. The letters, words, and paragraphs had to be counted. The document became invalid if 2 letters touched each other. The middle paragraph, word and letter, must correspond to those of the original document. So they had checkers that were checking the stuff constantly. The documents could only be stored in sacred places, i.e. synagogues. No document containing God's word could be destroyed. They were stored or buried in a genaza, a Hebrew term meaning hiding place. Now, this becomes significant later because what ended up happening in terms of this transmission and verification of the text is that some of the really valuable manuscripts that were found later were found buried in synagogues. They were discarded as something that they were not going to use as a working manuscript, but from a standpoint of us, from a historical basis of confirming what we did have, they're obviously very useful for that. So there were a lot of these 6,000 manuscripts that were buried when they found. These were usually kept in a synagogue and sometimes in a Jewish cemetery. So it's kind of an interesting process, is it not, what ended up happening there? All right.
Curtis?
Yes.
I remember reading too, in relation to number 7, that the scribes, whenever they were writing or copying the manuscript, that they would put a string at the top of each side of the page and then cross them. And whenever they would compare their manuscript they had just made with the older original one, it had to be the same letter that was covered by the cross.
Well, I was going to say, they had to have quick ways of doing checks. And so covering things and making sure that certain letters were visible were some of those quick checks. But it's a good point, Jerry. That's good. All right. Let's talk about Old Testament manuscripts a little bit. Now we're going to get into some of the actual finds and some of the historical background on some of these. The Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts. Let me see here. Okay. All right. In regards to these manuscripts here, this is the Aleppo Codex, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. This is going to sound a little nerdish to you, I'll admit before I say it, but one of the books that I'm reading right now is called the Aleppo Codex. I'm reading it, I say I'm reading, it's an audible book I'm listening to, but it reads like a mystery novel. As I'll tell you in just a moment, the Aleppo Codex is the oldest, most complete Masoretic text of the Old Testament. And I'm going to explain to you who the Masoretes were and how they figure into this. But it was extremely valuable, and there were battles and wars fought over it, and that's it now. All right. So we had the Nash Papyrus. The Nash Papyrus was it's an extant damaged copy of the Shema. And you guys know the Shema is Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, that passage there. And 2 fragments of the 10 Commandments, okay? And it was dated, to give you an idea, it's just a fragment, but this is a very old fragment. It goes back to the 2nd century BC, so before Christ. All right, the Codex Quirinius, that was a manuscript formed with pages, and it was around AD 895. And this is a more complete manuscript, this particular codex was. Anytime you see the word codex, by the way, those are parchments in book form, okay? That's kind of like we'd have a book today. It's not a fancy binding like this, but I'll show you as we go through here, I'll show you what a codex looks like. The Aleppo Codex, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. It's a very famous, very significant codex. The significance of it, by the way, is that this was the first time, up until the time of I'll go ahead and talk about this, up until the 900 AD time frame, the 10th century, the Hebrew manuscripts, what kind of format were they in? They were in, when the Hebrews wrote, they wrote without vowels, okay? And so what the Masoretes did, these scholars, they came in and added the vowels back, okay? And you talk about an incredibly difficult task. I was reading some of this, and it's a little tedious, or I'd share it with you, but how they went about determining where these vowels would be inserted. If you can imagine a whole page full of nothing but consonants, okay, and them coming back in and adding the vowels and getting them right. So the Aleppo Codex was the first complete Old Testament manuscript added with the vowels, okay? That's one of the other significances of it. Let's see what else. about 930 AD. One of the problems, because it was generated in Jerusalem around 930 AD, what happened just after this, around 1000 AD? And I'll give you another hint. It involved the Muslims and the Christians. The Crusades. And what did the Crusades do? They came into Jerusalem, and if you remember that first crusade, they basically destroyed Jerusalem. The Christians did. They came in and conquered the Muslims and took Jerusalem. And so the Aleppo Codex and things like that were damaged in those wars, the Crusades. They were doing it for what they considered to be a noble purpose, but what they ended up doing was damage a lot of things. Relics and particularly manuscripts that were stored in Jerusalem. So the Aleppo Codex is almost complete. It's not complete now. The Leningradensis is another codex. Obviously, it's related to Russian origin. It was generated by the Jews in Old Cairo in AD 1008. And okay, historical records say that it was copied from the Aleppo Codex. So it was one of those original copies from that. And then these Geniza manuscripts, these were the ones that I talked about being buried and stored and those sorts of things. There's a number of those that were found in Cairo. So these were some Old Testament manuscripts. What my note here says that there were 400,000 fragments in Cairo stored as part of these manuscripts. All right, Dead Sea Scrolls. Have any of you been to the Dead Sea Scroll Museum? Okay, Brian, you've been. It's a pretty remarkable thing if you've seen it. I don't know, this is not showing very good contrast. You may not be able to see it. The Isaiah scroll is, you see with that hole in the ceiling over there, and you'll have the 28-foot long Isaiah scroll that's underneath there. This was the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've probably heard of them for a long time. They were found in 1947 by some Bedouin boys that were playing in these cave areas in Qumran. Qumran, if this picture, for context, I should have backed off and showed you where this is, but the Dead Sea is like right here, okay? And so this is right up against the Dead Sea. And there's several things here that make this the ideal storage place. It's very, very, very dry. It was sealed up and sealed in these jars for 2,000 years. And so when these Bedouin boys came into this to the cave, they were throwing rocks at each other just like young boys do. And they hit some of these pottery vases that were stored in there, and one of them broke, or a couple of them broke, and guess what tumbled out of there? Some of these scrolls that were in an absolutely incredible find. The museum is called the Shrine of the Book. I've always called it the Dead Sea Scroll Museum, but it's the Shrine of the Book. You can see, I don't know how well you can see this, but you can see these old storage, this pottery here, storage pottery. That's what it looked like. That's what these look like where they found these various scrolls. And for the most part, the scrolls that they found were Masoretic text, okay? The Masoretes, I'm sorry, they weren't Masoretic text. The Masoretic text was used later to compare to them. These were texts that went back into the 2nd century BC and were recorded and stored. They also included the Septuagint. I've talked to you a little bit about that before, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. So the Septuagint was there, and also in here were a number of what we would call commentaries, where they were statements written about the text, giving background on them, and when they were observed, when these texts were read, kind of like a commentary, if you will. And then, of course, the Apocrypha was there. Talked a little bit about the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was part of this find of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, what good are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, one thing that's happened, you remember that sheet that we just showed there as to how precise and how accurate they were in terms of copying these texts. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, for the most part, were generated in the 2nd century before Christ and the century before Christ. So the 2 centuries leading up to Christ. So if the Masoretes that started doing their vowel additions and started doing their copying started around 900 AD, so you're talking roughly 1,000-year gap, okay? So you can take the Aleppo Codex, say an example of the Masoret scholarship like the Aleppo Codex, and you can compare it to the Dead Sea Scrolls. For example, the Isaiah scroll, which is 28 feet long, has all of Isaiah on a scroll, one scroll, okay? And it's all handwritten. That's incredible. It's beyond priceless, the Dead Sea Scrolls that they have there. So what do you think they found when they started comparing the text between what the Masoretes had developed? And you remember when they worked, the Masoretes, they just took a collection of older manuscripts that had been passed down through the ages to them, and then they started adding vowels to them and collecting them together into these codices that could be used in Jewish synagogues. The accuracy was over 99% comparison to what the Dead Sea Scrolls were. So essentially what we had was that the Dead Sea Scrolls were an incredible verification of how effective that the Jewish copyists were. And can you imagine that? It's almost beyond comprehension, and it also tells you that Providence was probably involved in, or was involved in this, for the propagation of text over 1,000 years with virtually no mistakes. And the mistakes that were there were mistakes where they may have put a vowel in a wrong place, or a pronunciation mark in a wrong place, or a misspelling, or those sorts of things. It's just amazing, just amazing. And this is a place too that you can go and see. Now, we had a former member of Memorial Parkway, Ron Wicks. Some of you name him, I'm sure name him, Ray and Pat, some of them remember the Wicks family. But they were members at Memorial Parkway for a long time. And Ron, do y'all remember the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit that was at the Von Braun Center and has been through here in Huntsville several times? Well, that's Ron Wicks' collection, okay? And Ron had gotten, basically what he had were copies of all these things, but it's very interesting to see the collection of things that he had, but you could still go and see what these scrolls look like and get a good idea of what they were. They called them facsimiles, these first generation copies. One thing I'm going to bring for you when we do translations, I don't know if I'll bring it next week, probably the following week, I have a facsimile, a first edition facsimile of the King James 1611 Bible that I'm going to bring in and let you guys take a look at. It's enormous. It wouldn't sit on that stand there, it'd break that stand down. But it's like, It's this size here before it's open, and it probably weighs 50, 60 pounds. But I want to bring it in. Have any of you ever read any of the original text of the King James in the Middle English? Well, you'll get to see it when I bring it in, but I'll bring it in when we do translations. It's amazing. But the point was that this is what I have is a facsimile copy of the original printing of the King James Bible, and this is what they were doing here. They were doing facsimile copies of these things. All right, let's see if there's anything else. We could go through a lot of the detail, but the real significant thing here is that this is the most significant witness to the ancient manuscripts that were used. Now remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. All right, the King James Bible, which was translated from earlier English versions like the Wycliffe, and I'll cover that when we do translations here in a couple weeks. But it was dated 1611, the original King James work was. So that is what, 330 years later, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So what about the King James text that were used? Well, what did we just say about the accuracy of those scrolls and those copies? Well, when you look at the King James Old Testament, and you compare, you get incredible correlation, very high correlation. Now we're going to talk about the New Testament in just a little bit, and there's not problems with the New Testament, but there are certain passages that we'll discuss, okay, when we get to the New Testament. By the way, one of them is a copy that I passed out to you tonight. That's the story of the adulteress in John 7:53 through 8:11. I'll talk a little bit about it. All right, okay. I'm going to skip over this. All right, quality of Old Testament. I've already done this. I'm going to skip through it because I want to get to the latter part of this anyway. All right, early New Testament manuscripts. Let's talk a little bit about that. When you start talking about New Testament manuscripts, this is where I talked about there were roughly 6,000 manuscripts and manuscript fragments that are extant right now or have been discovered of parts of the New Testament. All right, and so these, over a period of centuries, these fragments were gathered together and collected and translated. All right, these were written in Greek. Okay, these manuscripts are all written in Greek, and so when you started translating them into, say, the Coptic text for the Egyptians, or into German or French or whatever, and then eventually into English, all of those came from the collections of Greek manuscripts that were generated for translators to work from. Okay, that may not. I mean, that may be an assumption for you to just say, okay, that's what happened. But go back and look at these New Testament Greek manuscripts. This is what formed the basis for what was later translated into English. Now, the translators had to work with what they were given, the text that they were given. So this is kind of an important discussion here. 362 unsealed manuscripts and 245 unsealed lectionaries from the 2nd to 10th century. Anyone know what an unseal is? Unseal is written in all caps, okay? That's written in all capitals. And then later, this next term, 89% of the 5,366 New Testament manuscripts are minuscules. Minuscules written in small letters, okay? And notice the difference. The unsealed manuscripts go from the 2nd to the 10th century, the minuscules from the 9th to the 15th century. One problem that we had, obviously you want to get as old a manuscript and as complete a manuscript as you can. Isn't that what you'd want to do if you were doing a translation? Well, the problem was when the time of the King James Bible came around, there was a man named Erasmus that had put together the entire Greek New Testament for translation. And he had to work again off the text that he had, and there were probably 400 to 500 Greek manuscripts at that time. This is way before these old 4th and 5th century manuscripts were found. And so they worked off that, and most of their manuscripts were minuscule manuscripts. Notice this, sometimes it's called the majority text, sometimes it's called the received text. This was the text used for the Tyndale and Wycliffe Bibles, which eventually became used for the King James, okay? It's a little different from the text that we use for the ESV, New American Standard, that NU text that I mentioned at the first of class. I don't mean to confuse you, and I'll be more clear with it as we go through some of this, but just keep in mind the King James translation was worked off different Greek manuscripts from what was used for these later translations, okay? Let's see if there's anything else I want to cover here. Thousands and thousands of these manuscripts. And remember, they were mostly fragments. They may have part of the book of John and part of Matthew and that sort of thing in them. So when we got to the unsealed manuscripts, this is the last slide for this, and I'll introduce this. In the 19th century, the 1800s, there were some discoveries made of unsealed manuscripts that went back all the way to the time frame of 325 AD or so. Now, let me ask you a question. Any of you know a little bit about history. What happened around 325 AD?
Constantine, Council of Nicaea.
Okay. The big thing there is Constantine, okay, and his mother Helena. What ended up happening there is, up until the time of Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, how were Christians treated? How were Christians dealt with up to that time? They were persecuted and killed. I mean, that's just the way it was. They were. And so you didn't have churches, there were no church buildings, and you didn't have songbooks, you didn't have script Bibles, you didn't have any of that stuff. So when Constantine became the emperor, he commissioned the scholars at the time to produce 50 copies of the Bible. Okay, 50 copies of the Bible. Now this is significant. This is significant. Now those 50 copies that Constantine had commissioned were done in codex form, in book form, on parchment and those sorts of things. Well, it's generally believed, it's almost certain, that these first three manuscripts here, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, are 3 of those 50, okay? Which means that they are incredible value to the transmission of the text, for us to look at, and what's in these great Greek manuscripts was very remarkable. So I want to talk a little bit about them. Before we stop, though, because we're about to run out of time, I want to share with you real quickly the story about Sinaiticus, which is my favorite of all of them. It's the most complete copy of the Bible, and it goes back to 325 AD or so. There was a man named Count Tischendorf who went to I don't think I included that. No, I didn't. I was going to generate a slide and show you. He went to the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. And he visited there because he had heard that there were some old manuscripts there. He was a historian and a Bible scholar. and he was looking for old manuscripts. When he got there, this was in 1844. When he got there and came into the monastery, what he found was lots and lots of rolls of manuscript, but he also found 43 complete rolls of manuscript that were in a, for lack of a better term, the trash can, okay? And these monks that were there at this monastery were using them to start fires. It was the middle of winter when he got there, and so they were using them to start fires with. They were Sinaiticus. They were Sinaiticus, and so when they showed him what was in those bins, he was like, stop. Yeah, these were 43 rolls that he got to begin with, and he took them back and he said, well, I'll tell you a little bit more complete story of it when we start class next time, but you can imagine the excitement of a man to find something like that. It was a complete copy of the Septuagint Old Testament, you know, the Greek translation of Old Testament, and then a nearly complete New Testament from 325 AD. And it was in the trash can. It was in the trash can. That story blows me away every time I think about it, and every time I think about how it happened. But God is great. You know, God saw in the wisdom of sending Tinctoreth there, and he was able to, eventually there were almost 400 rolls that he recovered, scrolls. And I'll tell you a little bit about them next week, and we'll talk about what the significance of these manuscripts are to the modern text and to textual criticism. So we'll talk about that. I want to talk about text types, how different text types evolved, and then we will introduce next week translation. We'll go ahead and introduce translation. We'll do some of the early ones, some of the Coptic and original language translations from the early centuries. And then in 3 weeks, we'll get into the English translations, okay? All right, thank you.
that are evening. We're about to begin our service, and our first song later this evening will be Heart and Husband. Sam Kackerman will have the devotional message for this evening. We'll then be led in a song of invitation by Jerry Wilhoit, and we'll be closed in prayer by Stephen Trammell, after which I'll just have a few closing announcements before our dismissal. So let's go ahead and get started with our service this evening.
We will be singing Thank You, Lord, number 888. Thank you, Lord, for loving me, and thank you, Lord, for blessing me. Thank you, Lord, for making me whole and saving my soul. Thank you, Lord, for loving me. Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul. Let us all with one voice sing praises to Christ the Lord. Let us all unite in song to praise Him all day long. Thank you, Lord, for loving me. Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul. Please reveal your will for me so I can serve you for eternity. Use my life in every way. Take hold of it today. Thank you, Lord, for loving me. Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul.
We have slides this evening. Some of you say, uh-oh. But my wife told me I was going to keep it short. I decided to stay with my first thought after considering doing several things. So tonight, we're going to study about, well, not exactly mules. We're going to use mules as a starting point to kind of set a mindset on a particular thing. I spent the first 8 years of my life growing up on my grandfather's farm. It was a red clay, hard scrabble farm over in Lauderdale County. Now, my grandfather had 2 mules, Frank and Kate. Now, pause for just a moment and realize that names are important. Frank and Kate were the mules. On my mother's side of the house, I had 2 aunts named Bertha and Kate. And I had to always be careful to make sure I didn't get the 2 sets of names mixed up. I didn't think it would matter to the mules. Now think about mules for a moment. They're beasts of burdens, work animals. I can remember the mules hooked up to the plow, maybe to a disc, a harrow. Maybe they would be pulling a hay mower, a hay rake. I'm going to have to pause for a minute, Rusty. These are generational things. And since Rusty's now the expert on generational things, I'm going to let y'all go to him and let him explain these things to you. But some of these concepts, maybe even a mule, might be difficult for us to grasp. But if you can envision these 2 mules hooked up to these farm implements and pulling them through the ground. And then, as you see here on the right, they would pull the wagon and they would go right down the rows of corn. And the workers, that would be the people, would be off to the sides of the wagon, breaking the ears of corn off the stalks and tossing them up into the wagons. and the mules would stand there doing nothing. But eventually, when you finished working that area, the mules were smart. They knew to go on, they knew how far to go, and they knew when to go and where to stop, and you'd continue on till you harvest the corn. Now think for a moment. These mules spent all week working, laboring. It seemed as though they seemed to know when their day of rest was coming. And it was amazing because on their day off, you could just see them enjoying extra grain. They would nibble on hay, drink water. They would gallop and buck. And then sometimes you could even see them rolling in the dirt like little kids. They were enjoying their rest. Now, I want you to think for just a moment, not about mules so much, let that set your mind, but I want us to think about rest and labor. Rest from our labor. There's three aspects that I want us to look at relative to this. And as we look at it, I need to look at it and say, okay, where am I in this? The first one, you might think, I'm tired, I want to go lay down and take a nap. And you lay down, and guess what? You can't rest because you're not tired. I haven't worked for it. Now there's the physical application of this, or the aspect. Let's look at the spiritual application. For those who do nothing, Isaiah says, there is no peace to the wicked. That word peace could be translated rest. It's a misquotation to say there's no rest for the weary. The scriptures say there's no rest for the wicked. There's also the concept of I've worked, but when I lay down, I realize there are things that I've left undone, those important things, the right things that I should have done. I'm not at ease. I've got to get up and go do something about what I've left undone. Perhaps Christ's words, woe unto the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. They had left undone those weightier matters. Perhaps in our life there are things that we've left undone. And then the last one. You've worked hard. You've done the right things. You've done those important things. And your mind is telling you, I'm tired. I'm at peace. I can rest. All is well. Look at this passage, Revelation chapter 14. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. And it goes on to say that they may rest from their labors. I think it's interesting that I can relate to mules. And no, it's not because both of us are stubborn. But I think it's because of this labor aspect. You think back from the time of sin entering in the Garden of Eden, there's been work that had to be done. The physical aspect of work that came in, but the spiritual aspect of labor that we're all commanded to do. Where am I in that process? I'm not at peace with God. I haven't done anything. I've done things, but I'm at ease because I haven't done all the things that I should. Or I'm very content and assured of my rest. Thoughts on mules, I guess. But I want you to think about the invitation right now. Look at this passage with me. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. There's labor to be done. Each one of us have our responsibilities in those areas. Our challenge tonight is to look at ourselves in terms of these three aspects. Where am I in this? What challenges do I present to myself so that I can stand approved to God? If there's some way that we can help you tonight by your coming forward, then we want to do that. But mainly, we want God's word to appeal to each one of us, for each one of us to have a response to his invitation. If you will, while we stand and sing.
Bow with me, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this day that you blessed us with. We're grateful for this opportunity we had to meet together tonight, to study from your word and sing songs of praise to your name. Dear God, we ask that you be with us throughout the rest of this week. We ask that you allow us to be better examples for you throughout the rest of this week. Dear God, we're mindful of those who are sick, who have lost loved ones. We ask that you be with them and offer them a special measure of comfort. Dear God, thank you, dear God, for your Son who died on the cross to save us from our sins. In his name we pray. Amen.